Congratulations on following your dream to purchase your own practice, whether this is your first or your 10th. Hi, I'm Dr. Mick Kling, President and CEO of Envision Optometry in San Diego, which I founded over 20 years ago. Since then, I've acquired 7 practices and worked with countless Vision Source practice owners and associates as a practice transition advisor. While the process can vary each time, I believe there are 7 steps key to a successful transition, and I'm excited to walk you through them. Before we get started, here's a preview of the 7 steps and timeline to purchasing a practice. Step 1 is called the buyer and seller engagement. Step 2 is what we call the exploratory due diligence process. Step 3 is crafting your offer and submitting your letter of intent. Step 4 is the confirmatory due diligence process. Step 5 is what we call pre-closing. Step 6 is the closing. And step 7 is the post-closing and beyond. Step 1 is the buyer and seller engagement. The first step is to determine your why you want to purchase your own practice. By now you probably already know that ownership can unlock so many benefits, including higher compensation, autonomy, and wealth creation, as well as some serious financial and operational responsibilities that I'm confident you'll be able to embrace as a new business owner. So where are you going to open this practice? Location is one of the most important considerations, especially if you're willing to be flexible. For example, many rural practices enjoy lower staff wages and occupancy costs compared to those in a larger city, as well as standard of living advantages like low traffic and crime. No matter where you choose to open shop, I recommend you conduct a thorough geospatial analysis to learn as much as possible about your location, including population growth and demographics of your potential patients, to make sure you have a solid market. Next, you need to find a serious seller. I always advise getting curious about what's driving their decision, whether it's retirement, health, divorce, or financial issues. In most cases, there are usually pushes and pulls behind the seller's motivation, which can provide lots of insight into their negotiation tactics. What you want is a highly motivated seller who is reasonable, realistic, and motivated to get the deal done. Most serious sellers will require buyers to complete a non-disclosure agreement. This is a legally binding document between both parties to agree to share information in a confidential manner. Sometimes serious sellers also offer a confidential information memorandum or a broker's summary, which can help you summarize the major assets of the business, including a general overview of the business, some information about the revenue of the practice, some information about the operating expenses and working capital of the business, something about accounts receivable and practice debt, and of course, key office metrics. And as we wrap up step number 1, I want to leave you with a few extra tips on working with sellers. It's important to understand the seller's motivation to sell. This is really key to getting the deal done. For your first meeting with the seller, always choose a neutral location and be clear on what you're looking for in terms of location, practice size, culture, and any practice specialties. Be prepared with your questions and what information you will want the seller to provide as well. Give the seller your why. This can really help with getting the deal done. Advise the seller on how you're going to pay for the practice. That might be a bank loan, personal resources, or if you are wanting the seller to carry the note. Be prepared to sign that non-disclosure agreement. And remember, deals get complicated because of the people involved. There are many dynamics and emotions involved when selling and buying a practice, so just keep everything in perspective. Always utilize your own attorneys, accountants, and advisors, and make this clear to the seller. If the seller is using a broker, the brokers often want to represent both parties. This is a major conflict of interest. Step 2 is the exploratory due diligence process. Next, you need to conduct a thorough due diligence, which is a bit like looking under the hood, so you can make an informed decision about whether you should make an offer on the practice. Some of the questions you want to ask the seller include practice details, some information about the practice operations, information about the insurances accepted in the practice, information on the employees that work there. You also want to know a little bit about the equipment and practice debt, and some information about the facility itself, and of course you'll want to know about the retail information, what products they sell. And finally, you'll want to understand some financial information about the practice. You might feel a bit awkward about asking a seller for financial documents, but don't. If you plan to borrow money for the purchase of this practice, a lender is going to ask you for all this information anyway. And it's an important part of your financial due diligence in order to create your practice pro forma. This is simply an analysis of the projected income and expenses of the practice for the next 3 years. This, along with a careful cash flow analysis of the historical performance of the practice, will help you decide what a practice is worth and if you can afford it. In addition to your questions, make sure you take a good look at the external and internal appearance of the practice, including the visibility of the office, the cleanliness both inside and out. How easy is it to find parking? Is it located next to a busy intersection? And what are the surrounding businesses next to the practice? How does the office signage look? When you enter the practice, what's the entryway look? Where's the location of the reception desk? And how are the exam rooms laid out? Take a good look at the type and functionality of the equipment, and make sure you take a look at the practice management and electronic health records that are used in the practice. And finally, take a look around and make sure there's room for potential of expansion as you grow the practice. What you are really doing with these analyses are looking at the value of the practice, which is made of two kinds of assets, tangible and intangible assets. Intangible assets include things like the reputation of the seller, which is sometimes called goodwill, patient records, and a covenant not to compete. The majority of the value of a company comes from the goodwill as well as the anticipated future cash flow, which makes it intangible. The smaller portion of a practice's value comes from the tangible assets like equipment you need to see patients. You'll also want to pay attention to the frame inventory and how it's displayed. Is it appealing to you? Because if this is going to be your practice, you want it to reflect your personal aesthetic. And at $50 to $100 per frame, this inventory is part of the practice valuation, as are the practice financials, including things like the profit and loss statement, the current balance sheet. You'll also want to take a look at the tax returns of the practice, both personal and business. You also want to look at the aging report or the accounts receivable report. And it's always a good idea to take a look at the bank statements for the last 3 to 6 months. These documents play an important part of your financial due diligence in creating your practice pro forma. This will help you decide what a practice is worth and if you can afford it. It's also used by lenders to determine how much money they will lend you. I can't emphasize enough how important this process is. You'll also want to know key performance metrics such as revenue per exam, exam capture rate, frame capture rate, lens pairs capture rate, average eyewear sale, contact lens sales, exams per doctor hour, and revenue per doctor hour. While you're in the practice, this is a great opportunity to check the patient exam schedule to see if there are available appointments or a waiting list of patients. Revenue per comprehensive eye exam is another simple calculation you can perform by dividing total revenue from the past year by the number of routine comprehensive eye exams. This is an important measure that can give you insight into how well the practice is selling eyewear products, including contact lenses, and charging and collecting fees. A good ballpark number is around $400 per exam. Practice culture is another hugely underrated goodwill asset you absolutely must assess. If you're looking at a practice worth about $1 million, it probably has fewer than 10 employees, so you want them to be the kind of people your patients and you want to be around. Another element to consider in your due diligence is whether the seller will continue to have a role in the practice after closing. Will they stay on to see patients, consult, charge fees, or be involved in any way? Finally, it's important to communicate with the seller's landlord your intention of buying the practice. In most cases, the landlord will assign the existing lease and lease terms to you once you take ownership. This is extremely important since you don't want to find yourself legally committed to a purchase of a practice without first finalizing the details of the office lease. Step 3 involves crafting your offer. Once you've completed the exploratory due diligence process and determined that this is what you want, it's time to make an offer. First, you'll want to assemble your team of advisors. At a minimum, this should include an attorney with experience with business transactions. You'll also want to have a CPA who is willing to teach you about the finances of your business, like the profit and loss statement and balance sheet. You'll also want to make sure you have a lender from a major bank or a credit union. And finally, it's a good idea to have a mentor or a trusted advisor who can provide you with business advice and support. It's never too early to start considering how you're going to pay for the practice and engage lenders in your area. In many cases, regardless of a practice appraisal or negotiated purchase price, the practice often will sell for what a lender is willing to lend a borrower. Most banks will make a lending decision based on the global cash flow of the borrower. We've already discussed that the true value of a practice is essentially what a buyer is willing to pay. However, before you put in an offer, ask for a copy of the practice appraisal if one was performed. Many sellers hire an appraiser who can summarize the tangible and intangible assets and apply common valuation methods. When it comes to practice valuation, in my opinion, the most reliable way to determine a value of a practice is by measuring what the practice will support after your mortgage, bills, and taxes are paid. I find this is the least subjective method of valuation and one preferred by lenders. It's important to keep in mind that lenders only lend about 80% of available cash flow and have an arbitrary lending limit of 60 to 80% of practice revenue. So if a practice sells for higher than this limit, it will be imperative to come up with another method of financing. Now, once you've established a fair market value for your practice, how you take ownership is an extremely important decision. Generally, you can choose an asset purchase or an entity or stock sale. Buyers generally prefer asset purchases as liability doesn't transfer, while sellers prefer stock sales since it lowers their tax burden. At its simplest, an asset purchase means you're purchasing the tangible and intangible assets from a seller, but not the actual company, which means you avoid any risk of liability from the previous owner's business. In an asset purchase, the IRS requires the buyer and seller to classify all assets as tangible and intangible. You'll want to lean on your CPA for this, but basically tangible assets are taxed to the seller as ordinary income, while intangible assets are taxed at the current capital gains rate. Therefore, the seller may prefer a higher purchase allocated to intangible assets than tangible, as ordinary tax rates are typically higher at the time of the sale. A stock sale means you purchase the actual company's stock. As a buyer, you can't depreciate the assets with a stock sale, so you lose a tax advantage. This is where you'll want to leverage your CPA and potentially reduce the purchase price to account for this loss in tax benefit. However, you also avoid re-credentialing all of your medical and vision plans, as the federal tax ID will be transferred to you. You'll definitely want to make the most of your attorney and tax advisor on this topic, as there may be circumstances that influence your decision on how to take ownership, as well as how to allocate the purchase price. The IRS will require the buyer and seller to agree on the allocation of purchase price, since there are different tax implications for each party. Now it's time to work on your letter of intent. The letter of intent contains the price that the buyer will pay, as well as any contingencies built in. It should also include all terms and conditions of the sale, financing, lease, type of sale, and anticipated closing date. Finally, one additional consideration will be how you and the seller agree to manage the accounts receivable after closing. This represents the revenue generated but not yet collected from both patients and insurance companies prior to the day of closing. Generally, the seller retains ownership of the accounts receivables. You and the seller will want to discuss an efficient and practical method for tracking these receivables after the closing. Step 4 is what we call the confirmatory due diligence process. While your letter of intent isn't binding, it's now time to dive deeper into due diligence, especially in the following areas. Drafting the purchase agreement. This is the legally binding and final document that consummates the purchase of your practice, so it's a good idea to let your attorneys handle this after you have a signed LOI. You'll also want to finalize funding with your lender. And of course, you want to finalize the lease terms with your future landlord. And if your seller is going to continue working in the practice, this would be the time to draft the employment agreement. And finally, you'll want to create the purchasing entity, which is your new company. Again, you'll want to lean on your attorney to help you choose what type of business you want to form, whether that be a sole proprietorship, partnership, limited liability company, or corporation. You basically want to confirm all of your beliefs about the practice you wish to purchase. This process shouldn't take longer than 60 to 90 days and should coincide with the terms of the exclusivity clause agreed upon in the letter of intent. I also recommend obtaining tax clearance from the IRS, which confirms the business you want to purchase has no outstanding IRS liabilities. Step number 5 is the pre-closing. While you should definitely congratulate yourself after you've executed the purchase agreement, before you take over as the new owner on your designated closing date, you have a few more things to finalize. But know that each box you check off your list brings you closer to your dream of opening your own practice, making this an incredibly worthwhile way to spend your time. Insurance credentialing. After you've created your new company and obtained a federal tax ID, each vision and medical plan you choose to accept will have to be credentialed. It might be wise to hire a credentialing service to assist you. Financial and banking. Establish bank accounts for your practice as well as any merchant accounts for credit cards. You also need a payroll account with a payroll service provider if you plan to outsource your payroll. Employee HR. Prior to closing, make sure you have your HR plan in place. If you are buying the practice as an asset purchase, the seller will terminate all employees effective on the date of closing. If you are going to rehire them, you will need to do so immediately. You may also want to develop your employee handbook now and outline benefits like insurance, paid time off, and retirement plans. IT, electronic health records, and software training. If you're unfamiliar with the office practice management and electronic health record systems, it will be wise to begin training on how to use this software as soon as possible. The last thing you will want to deal with on your first day of practice ownership is learning how to use the practice software. Marketing. As part of the due diligence process, make sure you check in about which marketing programs are ongoing and which previous campaigns were most effective. This includes login information for the office, the website, and any third-party IT or SEO partners. Business licenses and insurance. If you're making an asset purchase and have created the company making the purchase, this is a great time to make sure your business license and other requirements like the state board are up to date. You will also want to adequately insure the office and its contents and obtain professional liability insurance. Step 6 is the closing. Once you're at the day of closing, make sure to celebrate all you've done to reach your goal. You will likely meet with the seller to tie up a few loose ends and sign all the dotted lines, as well as any additional documents, including the bill of sale, the promissory note if the seller carries the note, the security agreement, assignment and assumption agreement, assignment and assumption of the lease, settlement statement, escrow agreement, and bank loan documents. While it doesn't matter where you meet, meeting at the office can be symbolic and rewarding. Confirm the inventory and accounts receivables. The seller should have maintained the frame inventory, so it's important to confirm this. I recommend that you do just a quick spot check to make sure it's fair. You are just making sure the seller didn't offload the inventory after you sign the purchase agreement in closing. You can follow the same guidelines for accounts receivables. While it's important that you confirm the accounts receivable at closing, any receivable more than 120 days old are unlikely to be collected. Transfer of office keys. Make sure you have a copy of all office keys and codes you'll need. Also make sure you receive all software and website login credentials. Transferring payment to the seller. All funds that the seller is owed will be dispersed at this time. If a lender is involved, it's possible that the bank will initiate a wire transfer directly to the seller's account. All funds that the seller is owed will be dispersed at this time. If a lender is involved, it's possible that a bank will initiate a wire transfer directly to the seller's account. You may also be required to issue a certified check for any down payment or outstanding balances. Step 7 is post-closing and beyond. While you are now the new owner of your own optometry practice, there are a few things you can do in the next 30 days to ensure you have a successful launch. Handoff meeting with seller to tie up loose ends if needed. Training on any office systems. Let patients know via marketing campaign, email, letter, or direct mail that you are the new owner and you look forward to taking care of them. Notify vendors you are the new owner. Change name for utilities such as phones, internet, gas, electric, water, sewer, website names. Change website domain names and web hosting into your name. Record title documents such as vehicle titles, patents, trademarks, and copyrights. Although these are uncommon in the purchase of an optometry practice, it is something you may need to consider. Your attorney will be able to assist you with these tasks if they do occur in your situation. Obtain licenses or permits required in your state, county, or town. Notify necessary governmental agencies needed to properly comply with the requirement to operate your new business, such as a fictitious business name statement. Establish your new culture. Try not to change anything in your practice for at least the first 3 to 6 months. You've purchased a successful business, so this is a great time to observe and take notes. This is a great time to lead with a softer, open-minded, inclusive approach. Meet with your team. Be authentic. Introduce yourself. As you can see, purchasing your own practice relies heavily on getting the details right. It's often a huge help to work with experts who can guide you through the process so you can save time and money while gaining peace of mind. Reach out at any time to my team at Vision Source and let us help you.